Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Mom Atheist, but you can call me Amanda. So I was speaking to my friend the other day, and he asked me what I thought was the best way to move forward in the fight against climate change. I struggled for a moment to find a cogent answer because, to be honest, the real answer is so fucking complicated, and I didn't think he would want to spend hours listening to me ramble on about the ways to combat the climate crisis. The shortest version I could think of, and something that is a consensus with most of my colleagues, is that we need to be working together globally in order to save the planet. Not only should we be sharing our scientific progress with other countries, but we need to be working on an international level to save everyone. This is the only way that this is going to work. This idea of international unity in the face of a global crisis got me thinking about the worldwide protocols that have been formed to both fight climate change and global warming. Of the three, Montreal, Kyoto, and Paris, which have actually made a difference and why? Which have failed miserably? Is there a perfect way to both write and enforce a global protocol to combat the climate crisis? Okay, so let us start with the first of these international treaties, and that is Montreal. While Montreal may be the oldest of the three protocols, having been adapted in 1987, in all honesty, it has really been the most successful. Now, that being said, the Montreal Protocol did not have a sweeping agenda to combat the climate crisis. It was adapted in order to halt the increasing holes in the ozone layer by forcing countries to discontinue the use of chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. CFCs are fully or partially halogenated paraffins that contain carbon, chlorine, and fluorine. This chemical combination produces a volatile derivative of methane. Despite being considered volatile, CFCs are non-toxic and non-flammable, which is why they were developed to replace the original chemical refrigerants such as ammonia and butane. These early refrigerants were both toxic and flammable, respectively. CFCs were developed in the early 1900s after several leaks of the refrigerant methyl chloride had resulted in fatal accidents. Shortly after its discovery, the companies DuPont and General Motors formed the Kinetic Chemical Company, which was the first to produce what has become the trademark name for CFCs, known as Freon. Since then, the use of CFCs has expanded from refrigerants to aerosols, solvents, and foam-blowing agents because of their ability to be quickly converted from a liquid to a gas and vice versa. The reason that CFCs destroy the ozone layer, despite the fact that they are non-reactive on the Earth's surface where they are both produced and used, is because once in the stratosphere, the ultraviolet radiation causes CFC molecules to dissociate, producing both chlorine molecules and radicals. A radical, more commonly known as a free radical, is an atom, ion, or molecule that contains one or more unpaired electrons. These unpaired valence electrons are therefore considered to have dangling covalent bonds. It is these dangling bonds that cause free radicals to be more chemically reactive with both themselves and other substances around them. In the case of CFCs and atmospheric chemistry, the dissociated chlorine atoms react with ozone to the point where merely a single chlorine atom can convert thousands of ozone molecules into oxygen. This process then depletes the ozone layer, leaving holes in that protective part of the atmosphere. You can see how successful this protocol was in the image showing how large the ozone hole over the Arctic would have become without the treaty in place. The point of all of this is that the Montreal Protocol specifically targeted the use of CFCs in order to restore the ozone layers. This protocol required all nations, both developed and undeveloped, to eventually phase out CFCs by implementing hard targets based on research from scientists in the field. These scientists figured out the best and fastest way for countries to phase out their use of CFCs, taking into account special allowances for poor countries in the process. In fact, some of the poorest of countries were allowed to slightly increase their use and production of CFCs before they were asked to regulate and phase out production. More importantly, the Montreal Protocol was a legally binding treaty, holding each country accountable for their actions. By 1996, the US had already completely discontinued the use and production of CFCs, and all other countries eventually followed suit. Forcing developed countries to take the lead in this fight, while taking into consideration the limitations of poorer countries, is one of the reasons this protocol was so successful. So the next treaty on the list, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, attempted to follow in the footsteps of Montreal by also splitting the world into two categories: Annex B for developed nations and non-Annex B for developing nations, allowing the latter group to get a pass on the supposed legally binding targets that the richer countries were held to. However, the Kyoto Protocol, as ambitious as it was, ended up nearly a complete failure. As you can see in this graph, emissions from Annex B countries have only slightly declined since 1990, while emissions from non-Annex B countries have actually increased in the same time frame. Originally consisting of 192 countries, many of whom have dropped out since originally signing, including the US, which left in 2001, the Kyoto Protocol put forth a sweeping mandate that required industrialized nations to cut their greenhouse gas emissions within an allotted amount of time. Developing nations, those put into the non-Annex B category like India and China, were asked to comply voluntarily. The developed countries, 37 in total, as well as the whole of the European Union, were asked to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by only 5% of 1990 levels by 2012. The amount of greenhouse gas produced by these countries amounted to roughly 55% of the total world emissions. The second goal of the Kyoto Protocol was to encourage the transfer of green technology around the globe. In order to complete these goals, Annex B countries were given 3 flexibility mechanisms to combat greenhouse gas emissions. The first, and what I believe to be one of the better components of this protocol, was what is known as emissions trading. This allowed developed countries the ability to sell unused emission permits to other countries. Also known as cap and trade, emissions trading programs place a limit on the amount of emissions one country is allowed to produce, and also permits tradable allowances between countries. So if there's one country that is producing more emissions than regulated, they can buy allowances from another country that has some to spare. This cap and trade program establishes a global pollution limit, provides accountability for each individual country, as well as allowing for flexibility for individual emission sources. The second flexibility mechanism is known as joint implementation. Joint implementation allows for one developed country to implement or finance a climate project in another developed country and can therefore credit themselves with the emission reduction in that country. Lastly, the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, is the third and final flexibility mechanism. Similar to joint implementation, CDMs allowed developed nations to invest in greenhouse gas emission reduction in developing nations, essentially providing financial programs to these countries. Developing nations can claim carbon credits for the emissions drop in a developing country. The emphasis on these market-based mechanisms is the key reason why the Kyoto Protocol was a failure. By allowing polluters to buy themselves out of their obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the protocol took away the drive to do so. On top of the fact that the Kyoto Protocol was not actually enforceable and countries were not punished for either failing to live up to their commitments or dropping out entirely, was essentially how Kyoto failed. Our last global climate treaty is the most recent, which is the Paris Agreement. Adopted in 2015 by nearly every country on the planet, the Paris Agreement aimed to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions in order to keep the global temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius, although the consensus has reduced that number to 1.5 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. Up until Trump pulled us out of the agreement last year, each nation on Earth had signed on, with 179 of the 197 countries submitting a formal proposal on how they would individually combat climate change. Much like the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement establishes a framework for global action as well as support for developing nations. Here is a summary image of the Paris Agreement's goal projection, with the end result being net zero emissions and climate resilience by the year 2050. That's it. The agreement itself presents a wide-ranging pledge to combat climate change, as well as a commitment to invest in sustainable energy. The main reason why Paris is a failure is because these stipulations are nowhere near strict enough. And once again, it's easy for countries to either fail or drop out with little to no consequences. The commitments already set forth by the first 179 countries are still not enough to keep the increase in global temperature below 3 degrees Celsius, let alone 1.5. The worst thing about the Paris Agreement is that it allows for false hope that we really are fighting climate change to the best of our ability, when in all actuality, we are falling short in a big way. This false hope allows for countries to become lax in their fight against this growing epidemic. So, how exactly do we fix the issues with each of these protocols? What would be the best way to implement a new one that would actually put a dent in our fight against climate change? First of all, and what I cannot stress enough, is that this fight absolutely needs to be a global effort. Well, at the moment, the devastation of climate change is affecting some countries more than others. We are still all facing the obliteration of life as we know it on Earth at the same rate and in the same ways. And I understand that not every country gets along with the next. We have our socio-political issues that make it difficult to work with one another. But when it comes to climate change, these problems are petty and insignificant in comparison. We need to decide as a global community how to proceed with our fight against climate change. The next step would be all about punishment and reward. One of the main failures of the previous protocols is that they were easy to ignore without any negative consequences. And those that did not follow the protocol were, not incentivized properly. When it comes to punishment, there is no better option than carbon tax. I think by now we understand that money makes the world go round. A carbon tax directly sets a price per ton on carbon by defining a tax rate on greenhouse gas emissions. Taxation on emissions will only incentivize both countries and corporations to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. As it stands, 50% of global emissions are being produced by the top 10% of the richest countries on the planet. Carbon pricing in the form of carbon tax utilizes market mechanisms by passing the cost of emissions to the emitters. The fossil fuel industry is one of the richest on the planet. In fact, the energy industry is by far the most profitable, with fossil fuels currently attributing to a huge chunk of that industry. The only way to get fossil fuel companies to stop contributing so much to our global carbon footprint, they need to start losing money for the atrocities that they commit. Recalling the fact that the Paris Agreement falls short of our goal to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature, we need a working agreement to have stricter regulations and goals. What those need to be is a conversation for another time, but we are aware of the fact that under the Paris Agreement, we are still looking at a global temperature increase of at least 3 degrees Celsius, which is far too high of a jump for life to continue on Earth. Climate scientists have come to a consensus that a 2-degree hike in temperature will mean the end of life as we know it. Having a goal of 1.5 degrees is acceptable, and considering we are already at 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels and rising at a rate of 1/10 of a degree every decade at our current rate of fossil fuel consumption, we have a great deal of work to do. We need to set goals, especially for developed nations, that reduce their carbon emissions in a big way in a shorter amount of time. Set specific dates and prepare to hold those who fail to reach those goals accountable. That brings me to the next step in creating a working climate protocol, which is to hold countries accountable for their failures. There needs to be repercussions in the form of both sanctions and monetary fines for those who do not follow the rules of the new protocol. And these repercussions need to be steep. These countries that are already producing the most fossil fuel emissions are the richest in the world, and slapping them on the wrist with some paltry fine that will make barely a dent in their GDP will be absolutely pointless. If we not only impose steep fines for those who do not follow the rules, but threaten them with sanctions, cutting them off economically from the rest of the world, these countries will fall in line. The final suggestion I have for a working climate agreement is offering incentives for those countries that invest in sustainable energies. Research has proven that taking money away from companies that harm the planet and giving it to companies that actively promote sustainability is the most effective way to address climate change by far. Once again, this comes down to money. Redirecting funds directly to countries that promote environmental and social sustainability away from those who are massively contributing to the world's carbon footprint is a great way to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and further the science of alternative energies. A balance of both reward and punishment is essential to a successful climate protocol. Now, I realize that my suggestion for a working protocol may not be perfect, but it is not only a start, it is miles better than what is currently available in the form of the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol. As I mentioned before, global unity is really the key to saving this planet. If we don't work together, if we don't address the problem right fucking now, we are headed down a path of destruction the likes of which this planet has never seen. If you guys have any suggestions to add to my protocol plan, please feel free to leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your ideas to see how to save our planet. Once again, thank you for coming. I am Mama Atheist. Think critically.